When I was 21 years old, my husband's family offered to sell us a house that had been in his family for generations at an incredibly cheap price. They had a difficult time keeping it rented and did not want to hassle with it anymore. We jumped at the opportunity and moved in almost immediately. It was only a matter of hours before strange things began to happen. It did not take me long to decide that there was something or someone else other than us in that house. Almost every night we would hear something coming up the staircase. The steps were old, so you could hear every creak. Nick, my husband, would jump out of bed whenever he heard it to go make sure that someone hadn't broken in. It would always end the same. No one was there. The ghost appeared to get braver as time went on. We could hear the steps eventually come down the hall. They were getting closer to our bedroom door with each visit. Finally, the night came that we both had been dreading. Nick was sound asleep, exhausted from working hours of overtime. I heard the steps pass the doorway of our bedroom and enter our room. I felt slightly aware of something or someone approach the side of my bed I had my back turned to, but I was afraid to look. I just kept my face in Nick's chest and closed my eyes tightly. I felt as though there was someone right behind me, right behind my head, just staring at me. I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to turn around to check. I just wanted to fall back asleep as soon as possible. My hand searched under the covers for Nick's hand. I very softly and quietly moved my hand beneath his big palm. I did not want to disturb him. I just knew it would make me feel better if his hand was laying on top of mine. My back felt ice cold. I tried to bring the covers up tighter around my neck and back. That's when I felt it. Something moved briefly on the bed behind me. I did not acknowledge it. I forced myself to stay still as if I were still asleep. I felt that if I suddenly reacted, I would see something horrible, so I did not turn around. I did not move. That seemed to upset whatever was behind me. I felt the bed move again, but just ever so slightly. I felt that whatever was behind me was so close to me, it was almost touching my hair. I had that feeling on my scalp similar to when you have static electricity in your hair. I rubbed Nick's palm with the back of my hand. I think I was actually trying to wake him, but trying to do it quietly, so whatever was behind me would not notice. It didn't work. Nick just grunted a moment and then took another deep breath. He was still sound asleep. I felt another movement on the bed directly behind me again. I actually could feel the blanket I had wrapped so tightly around me tug on me a bit as if someone had laid some weight on it behind me. I was sure that something was trying to get even closer to me. Suddenly I felt air blow on my cheek. It was as if someone had just breathed on me, except it was a lot colder, ice cold. I tried rubbing Nick's hand again, only I did it more aggressively this time. He moaned a little and turned to face me, laying his arm across my side. That made me feel a little better. If there was someone or something directly behind me, he would have struck them with his hand when he put his arm around me. Suddenly, Nick's arm went flying off of me and backwards towards him. It was as if someone had picked up his arm and flung it off me. At that same exact moment, I felt a very strong tug on my hair, and I heard a whisper in my ear, "Get out of my room." The words struck me like a knife in my stomach. It was a very raspy, mean voice. I woke Nick instantly, but once again there was no one there. Many things happened in that house. We only lived there for 36 days. 36 days of pure mental hell. This story happened almost 21 years ago, so I was young and dumb. Cut me a little slack. I had just turned 19 like 2 weeks before, and I was pretty jazzed about life and what the future might hold for me. Being so young, I had a minimum wage job and still lived at home with my mom and now deceased stepfather. I didn't know where I wanted my life to go, but not many 19-year-old girls do. I was chilling in my room on a hot summer day watching TV and zoned out thinking about life until the phone rang. I had my own separate phone line in my room, and though I wasn't expecting any calls, I answered it. It was a wrong number, and the caller was a 40-something-year-old man with an interesting gruffly voice. He was impressed that I was so nice. He was so impressed, in fact, that he wanted to send me a free t-shirt and probably something else for being so sweet. Though I was young, I had been raped just a year before by my ex-boyfriend, so I was cautious of who I gave my address and number to. I declined and said that I was uncomfortable giving my address out to people I didn't know, and especially not over the phone. He told me he understood and asked me where I worked instead. He said he would bring it to me personally, and again, saying I sounded so sweet. He wondered if I was as beautiful as I sounded. I was of course flattered and a little curious about this dude. I figured work was a public place. I was never alone and there would be witnesses in the form of gawking, laughing friends who were also my coworkers. So why the hell not? I worked in a grocery store and figured maybe we'd get an extra customer to boot, so I told him where I worked. After maybe 20 minutes to a half hour, we finally hung up and I sort of forgot about the guy until that night. He called when he got off work, and somehow, the conversation turned sexual. I don't remember what was said, but I remember being more than a little freaked, and told him to cut it out. He did apologize, saying I just sounded so young and sweet that he was just turned on. I hung up that night hoping that would be the end of it, but that wasn't to be. He called me again a day or two later and told me to just listen. I listened and realized the guy was jerking off. I was grossed out and didn't want to jump to conclusions. He asked me if I knew what it was, and I said no. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I'm guessing he essentially told me he was rubbing one out and started growling some creepy dirty shit to me in his nasty, gruffly voice. He was calling me a bitch and a whore, and I told him I didn't like it, so fucking stop. He stopped, but I guess he was about to reach his peak, so he started doing it again, saying it would help him get off faster. I told him no, cut it out because it was actually scaring me. When he didn't stop, I slammed the phone down. He immediately called me back and was growling some other dirty shit that I didn't listen to. I hung up again. I never heard the guy's voice again, but for years, I would feel like I was being watched. The guy didn't know what I looked like or anything, but I couldn't help but be scared. He did know where I worked after all, or at least he could probably find it. Something else happened a few days after that, paired with the phone stalking bastard, contributed to my current conditions. Almost 21 years later, and I have a phobia of going anywhere by myself. I have social anxiety disorder, and I literally have a fear of phones. I don't even own a cell phone and don't want one. To this day, I still hear that damned gruffly voice in my head, and even having been married, divorced, and raising 2 teenage girls on my own, I still sometimes look over my shoulder wondering if he might be there. This happened when I was 9 years old, and I still don't have an answer to explain it. As a child, I was afraid of the dark. I still am. And I always told my mom to leave the door slightly open before I go to sleep. This particular night was the same as every other night. I said goodnight to my mom and she left the door how I liked it, so I dozed off to sleep. But soon I woke up, but when I checked my clock, it was midnight. I sat up in my bed and I felt somewhat strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that my door was wide open, but I remember clearly that my mom left it slightly closed. In the middle of the doorway, I noticed something black. I stared at it until my eyes focused and I could see the outline of what it was clearly. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, its eyes were open, staring at me, focused on me, and its eyes were a glowing crimson red. For some reason, I did not feel scared. I felt as though it wasn't there to hurt me. I felt very safe. I continued to stare at it, and it continued to stare at me. This wolf looked solid, and after staring at it for so long, I noticed fur. It never moved closer to me. It only stood at my doorway staring at me. I realized that it did not want to be touched by light, and that light did not want to be reflected off of it. Somehow I knew it was not going to hurt me. So after burning this wolf's image in my head of how it looked, I fell asleep. I woke up at around 3 a.m. in the morning and looked towards my door. It was closed shut. It was closed all the way, not how I liked it. I've wondered what it was. A demon? A guardian? Some wandering spirit? Well, this picture I came across one day is exactly what I saw when I was 9 years old. How could I forget? Ever since I began to wear gold jewelry, I haven't seen it, but I feel as though it's still watching me from the shadows, waiting. When I was 12, my mother and I moved into a decent-sized Victorian house out in the English countryside. I'd like to say that before these events took place since moving in, I was a shy, well-mannered girl who would never dream of doing the awful things that I did. The first few weeks of moving in, everything was great. I really liked our new house. But soon, things started to change rapidly. It started with the atmosphere. The rooms started to feel gloomy. And even when the sun was at its brightest, it still seemed really dark inside. When I sat alone in the living room, I would feel a small breeze brush past me, as if someone had walked by towards the front door. After a few weeks of this, my personality started to change. It started off as refusing to go to school, and when my mom would challenge me by trying to pull me out of bed, I would flip out, lock myself in the bathroom, and bang my head into the wall until I bled. I would harm myself daily and refuse to leave the house. Soon, social services got involved along with the mental health team, but nobody could find a logical cause for my change. A year went by and things only got worse. I was often home alone because my mom had to work. One afternoon, I called her telling her I needed to get out of the house because shit had really just hit the fan. The trauma of what happened that day still haunts me. I remember laying in bed when suddenly I had a very intense feeling of pure hate and rage take over me. From there, I only remember calling my mom in a panic, my blood dripping down my arms and staining the carpets. I sat in the corner of the living room waiting for my mom to get home. When she arrived, she just sighed and cleaned up the mess. I assumed she thought it was a cry for attention. She then took me up to the bathroom to run a bath. When we got into the bathroom, we saw "die" written in blood. We continued living there for another year, but I feel that these events are horrible enough, and there are a few things I really don't want to talk about. I will say that when I finally moved out, it was like the dark cloud over me instantly lifted. My mom now believes that something was in that house influencing my personality. The house has had a lot of new owners since we moved out. However, it seems that nobody lives there longer than a year. There's a landline phone in the cabin where I'm staying to finish my novel. Cell service is practically non-existent, and God knows we won't be seeing any major broadband providers stringing lines around here for another 50 years. I can get online using a 56K modem and connect to a shitty long-distance ICP, but I'll be damned if I'm getting more than 14.4 speed whenever it's windy out. It's always windy out. My plans for the days were pretty simple. I'd get up around 7, have breakfast, and start writing by 8. I'd make lunch around 1, call my wife at work during her own lunch break, then go back to writing until 6 or 7, then dinner and bed. On Saturday, when I picked up the phone to call Tasha during her lunch, the dial tone sounded off. It was pitched differently. You know how all the landline phones in the US have the same tone and you can get used to hearing it every time? Well, it wasn't that tone. It was pitched higher. It was as if the normal tone is an A note on a piano and the strange note on Saturday was an A sharp. The difference wasn't big, but it was definitely noticeable. At first, I was fairly certain it meant there was a problem with the line. But when I called Tasha, the call went through without any problem at all. The sound quality was no different either. I forgot about the dial tone until last night when I went to call Tasha before bed. Again, the pitch was off. It wasn't merely the difference between A and an A sharp, though it modulated slowly, as if sliding up and back from A to A sharp. The tone wasn't as pure either. There was static in the background. The wind outside had picked up, so I assumed it was affecting the ancient copper lines that crisscrossed the woodland county. The static waxed and waned with the modulating tone. I pressed my ear to the receiver, suddenly intrigued. There were voices in the static. I couldn't make out what they were saying over the interference and the tone, but they were unmistakably voices. There must have been some wire crosstalk over at the switching facility. I dialed Tasha and we talked for a little while. While we spoke, the wind outside intensified. Earlier, when I'd gone into town to get some groceries, the locals told me we were in for some snow. I assumed it was starting. Tasha and I were saying our goodnights when the power cut out. The room was utterly pitch black. We finished up and I fumbled in the dark to hang the phone up. With a sinking feeling, I remembered I'd forgotten to get new batteries for the 2 flashlights I kept in the kitchen. I carefully walked over to the desk and opened my laptop. Weak, pale light filled the room and cast bizarre shadows against the walls. Despite being 42 years old, I felt scared. I wanted to make a fire in the fireplace, but I'd neglected to bring any wood inside. It's rare that I make a fire. I'm always paranoid about accidentally burning the place down. Still, it was a risk I was willing to take in the face of the impending Stygian blackness of the cabin once my laptop died. I bundled up and went outside. It was somewhat brighter out there than in the cabin, and I could see snow was beginning to fall. There wasn't much, but with all the wind it still looked and felt like a blizzard. I grabbed an armful of wood from under the awning on the side of the cabin and headed back inside. As soon as I opened the door, I heard it. The phone had fallen from its cradle and the receiver was emitting extremely loud, dissonant tones. This time, the sounds were entirely unlike anything I'd heard from a telephone. The tone swept through the octaves like a damaged siren, frequently punctuated by bursts of static and, beneath it all, the unmistakable timbre of human voices. The hair on the back of my neck stood erect, and my skin's topography was reconstructed by goose flesh, buried inside the welling of the dial tone and the blast of white noise. I could make out individual words.
Declension, new, lunation, neurulation, God.
The light from my laptop faded into nothingness. I gasped and dropped the wood I'd been carrying. I rushed forward to hang up the phone, but I stumbled and fell, landing heavily on the floor with my head inches from the screaming receiver. The welling and static stopped. Wind buffeted the wooden exterior of the cabin. Terrified and not knowing what to do, I reached for the receiver to hang it up. My hand touched the plastic. An enormous crash rattled all sides of the cabin at once, knocking dishes from the cabinets and causing them to shatter on the kitchen floor. I screamed. The phone began making noises again. It started with a normal dial tone, but quickly warbled and warped into a shrill cacophony of sirens, static, and voices. Somehow, I was compelled to put the shrieking receiver to my ear. I fought the impulse with all my strength, even pushing my left arm against my right to stop it from moving. It was futile. The receiver touched my ear and the sounds were replaced by a single, hideously loud voice.
You are ours. You are ours. You are ours.
A needle of indescribable cold pain pushed through my ear. I felt its frigid length puncture the eardrum with a horrible snip sound, changing the blaring voice to a distorted buzz. Still, I felt the pressure of the intense volume against the destroyed membrane as the pain traveled deeper and deeper into my head. Everything went white. I woke up on the floor this morning with a splitting headache and a pool of dried blood in my right ear. The events of the previous night flooded back, and I scrambling to my feet in terror. The wreckage of the kitchen was strewn across the floor. Framed pictures of Tasha and me had fallen off the walls and shattered on the hard wood. Desperate for fresh air, I hurled myself towards the door and opened it. Surrounding the cabin, contrasting against the sunny snowscape, were thousands of dead birds. Each one had its head smashed with such a force that its eyes had burst and its beak was splintered into unrecognizable fragments. Vertiginous nausea caused me to sway and nearly fall into the carcasses. I stumbled backward into the house and slammed the door. I looked over at the phone. It was neatly placed on its cradle and looking as innocent as any telephone in any house. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up and dial 911, not after what happened. I poured through the fallen debris and found my keys. The legs of a drunkard carried me through the bird corpses to my truck. I pulled away from the cabin and somehow made it to the hospital without crashing. Right now, I am writing this with a borrowed laptop from a bed in the hospital. My right eardrum is ruined. They told me I'd experienced vertigo for quite a while, but I was given medication to make the sensation less nauseating. The injury to my ear was not enough to keep me hospitalized. In fact, it was hardly enough for the ER to take seriously, and they seemed irritated by my presence. That changed when they asked me how it happened. I explained it to them as best as I could, but all I could see in their faces was bewilderment. Over and over they asked me to repeat myself, but after a while, I started to get frustrated. One of them handed me a pen and paper and I simply wrote, "What is it so hard for you to understand?" A young nurse asked me to tell them again what happened. She held her phone out in front of her and I saw she was recording a video. Again, I explained. They listened intently as I spoke. Then the nurse stopped the recording. I shrugged my shoulders, wondering if recording me somehow got my story through their thick skulls. The nurse turned the phone toward me and I pressed play. I watched for a few seconds and started sobbing. On screen, when I opened my mouth to speak, all that came out was the shrill siren of warp dial tone. Hey guys, thank you all for watching my video, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Nightmare Army. I'm always looking for new soldiers in my Nightmare Nation. So guys, I feel I need to address an issue that you guys made very clear last video I uploaded, which was on Tuesday, a collaboration video, and the issue was that some of those stories were already narrated on other popular channels. And for that, guys, I am really sorry about that. Unfortunately, after making these types of videos, I don't really watch that many horror narrators that much just because I'm always busy working on the next video and the next story. So, I'm really sorry about that, you guys. It's my fault. Personally, I do want to bring more original stories to you guys. I don't want you guys clicking on my video, hearing a story that you heard off of Beat Busta, Corpse Husband, or Mr. Nightmare. So for that, guys, I really apologize. But I do have a solution to the problem, and that is focusing on more subscriber-submitted stories, which are more original for you guys and a breath of fresh air. So I leave it to you guys. Do you guys want me to focus more on subscriber-submitted stories and stay away from Reddit? And if that's the case, if you have a scary story you're willing to share, email it to me. I always got my email handy. But anyways, guys, thank you all for watching again, and I am sorry for last video, and just remember, the best ideas always come out of nightmares.